Imagine a war that didn't begin with tanks or treaties, but in the heavens, a war where angels clashed with fallen powers, and at the very heart of it stood a single, unstoppable being, the strongest angel ever created. He is heaven's warrior, earth's defender, the one who stands guard over a land drenched in prophecy and blood. Israel. For over 4,000 years, the world has watched the conflict between Israel and Palestine unfold. But what if I told you this battle is far older than any modern border? What if it began not on earth, but in the courts of heaven? This isn't just politics. It's prophecy in motion. It's a spiritual war that stretches from the pages of Genesis to the thunderous visions of Revelation. And at the center is a divine promise, a stolen birthright, and a celestial warrior, the archangel who still fights today. Could it be that the ancient feud between Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, still fuels the fire we see burning in the headlines? And could the Bible's most fearsome angel be the one enforcing God's eternal verdict? In this video, we uncover the angelic protector whose name is known in both testaments. We trace the roots of this conflict back to the very beginning through prophecy, covenant, betrayal, and divine intervention. What you're about to discover may change how you see today's world events forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and comment 7077. If your spirit senses the weight of this mystery, your support through super thanks helps us keep revealing what others leave in the shadows. This isn't just history, it's the battle behind the battle. You ready to see what's really going on? Let's begin. Israel and Palestine. The deep biblical roots of a 4,000-year feud in Genesis 12 to 1-3. God told him, "Go from your country to the land I will show you." Picture an old man waiting year after year for a son, the son God had promised, while his wife Sarah's laughter grew bitter with age. Finally, in her desperation, Sarah handed over her Egyptian servant Hagar. And from that union came Ishmael. When Ishmael was born, did Abraham's heart swell with hope that at last God's covenant was secure? So what does it mean for two peoples to each look back to the same patriarch, to each trace the lines of their blood to the same tent, and still feel such deep division? "I will make you into a great nation, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." In Genesis 15:18-21, God made a covenant with Abraham, marking out the territory from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Later, he repeated this promise through Moses, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, but for many Palestinians, it marked the beginning of dispossession and displacement. Can you feel how the Bible's ancient pages seem to ripple into modern streets? How words spoken to wandering herdsmen under starry skies still ignite passions in crowded refugee camps and bustling markets? If you were one of Abraham's descendants today, and in some mysterious way, aren't we all caught up in this story? How would you carry such a legacy of promise and pain? And again, through King David, under whose reign Jerusalem became the heart of their national and spiritual life. It is a reminder that the deepest conflicts are often family disputes stretched across centuries, that promises can bind as tightly as they divide, that even blessings can be the seeds of heartbreak. So as we trace these tangled roots, watch closely. The ancient drama is far from over. Its next act may yet surprise us all. The Old Testament brims with reminders of this divine pledge, as if God wanted them to never forget. "This land is yours forever" sounded so glorious, so simple. But was it ever truly simple? Many Palestinians trace their heritage to Ishmael or even to the ancient Canaanites, and other early inhabitants of the region, seeing themselves not as outsiders, but as sons of the very soil itself. Can you imagine standing on a patch of earth your ancestors farmed for centuries, only to be told by another that their claim, rooted in sacred texts, outweighs your family's graves? This is why the conflict over the land cuts so deep. It is not only political, it is profoundly spiritual. It is about identity and inheritance, memory and prophecy. It began with one man whose footsteps echoed through history, Abraham, known to this day as the father of both Jews and Arabs. Long before modern borders were drawn, before tanks rolled across deserts and children grew up under the shadow of barbed wire, there was a quiet family drama in the windswept hills of ancient Canaan, according to Genesis 17:19-21. God made it unmistakably clear that his covenant, this astonishing inheritance of land and blessing, would continue through Isaac and his line. In Genesis 16:11-12, he promised Hagar that her son would also become the father of a great nation. His hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. Could these ancient words have foreshadowed the restless struggles that have marked this region ever since? Imagine being there, witnessing the tender joy mingled with looming heartache. As two brothers played under the same sun, yet carried destinies that would pull their descendants apart for millennia, Abraham received a promise from God that would shape the destiny of nations. The heart of the matter, the place where this ancient bond fractured, lay not merely in geography, but in the fragile walls of Abraham's own tent. But then the impossible happened. When Abraham was 100 and Sarah 90, the dusty silence of their home was broken by the cries of another child, Isaac. Yet God did not turn his back on Ishmael. Over centuries, Isaac's line led to Jacob, whose children became the 12 tribes of Israel, while Ishmael's descendants spread across the deserts. It's traditionally recognized as the forefather of Arab peoples, including the Palestinians. The claim to the land for the Jewish people, the land of Canaan, modern Israel and Palestine, is far more than soil and stone. It is the embodiment of God's everlasting promise. But does eternity look the same to all people? For many Jews, the establishment of Israel in 1948, after the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust, seemed like the living fulfillment of prophecies from Ezekiel 37 and Isaiah 66, dry bones, coming to life, a nation born in a day. And maybe that's why this story continues to haunt us. 1948. A dividing line, the year 1948 stands as a jagged line across the heart of the Middle East. A moment that would forever divide memory and destiny. For the Jewish people, it was a day of almost unimaginable triumph. The rebirth of their nation after nearly 2,000 years scattered across foreign lands. Surviving pogroms, ghettos, and finally the monstrous shadow of the Holocaust. Many saw it as the living fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy, where dry bones would rise, flesh would cover them, and breath would return, restoring the house of Israel to their own soil. But while Jewish neighborhoods exploded with song and dance, another story was taking shape, marked by suitcases hastily packed, keys clutched in trembling hands, and tearful glances backward at homes left behind. Their arrival intensified after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when Britain, embroiled in World War I throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Jewish immigration surged, families fleeing pogroms in Russia, the tightening grip of anti-Semitic laws in Poland, later the monstrous rise of Nazi ideology in Germany. As new Jewish neighborhoods blossomed, and Hebrew was spoken openly in bustling markets, many Palestinian Arabs began to fear that their own future was slipping through their fingers. 6 million Jews were slaughtered in Nazi death camps, a genocide that scarred the conscience of the world. Inside the battered hulls, families wept, children went hungry, and many clung to battered Torah scrolls as their last link to hope. As Israel declared independence, Jewish refugees danced in the streets. But across dozens of Palestinian towns, families fled before advancing militias, or were driven out in the chaos of war. Fields lay empty, houses abandoned, with keys still swinging in door locks, ghostly remnants of lives abruptly severed. Does it ever strike you how history can turn on the slenderest of threads? That an ancient promise to a wandering shepherd could echo through the ages and crack open the very earth beneath modern feet. And if you stood in 1948, heart pounding at the sound of distant gunfire, but you have known whose side of the story was more just, realize that perhaps there were no simple answers at all. Meanwhile, Jewish underground groups like Irgun and Lehi grew impatient. They launched bombings and raids against British targets, demanding an end to immigration limits and to British rule itself. For them, the right to return wasn't a political bargaining chip, it was survival, sanctified by the same divine promise that had once led Joshua across the Jordan River. When the war ended, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors were stateless, broken in body and spirit, yet clinging to an unyielding hope. Could there be anywhere on earth that would take them in? Without quotas? Without closing the gates? For most, the answer lay in the land their ancestors once called home. Would you have felt it too, that tightening anxiety in your chest? Watching unfamiliar faces build new lives on streets where your ancestors traded bread and spices? And eager for regional alliances, pledged support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Calls rose to limit Jewish immigration and to halt land sales to new arrivals. But each protest seemed to ripple out into deeper conflict, and the stubborn hope that somehow, someday, a shared land might find room for all its children. But the next chapter of this story, that remains shrouded, waiting to be revealed. The tension finally erupted in the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. For 3 years, villages smoldered. British soldiers patrolled dusty roads, and neighbor eyed neighbor with growing suspicion. The revolt was crushed with British force, leaving thousands dead or imprisoned. Yet instead of resolving anything, it hardened lines in the sand. Jewish communities, more determined than ever, fortified their self-defense. Palestinian Arabs nursed a grief that would soon find new expression. To Jewish ears, it was a trumpet blast of hope. To Arab residents, it sounded more like betrayal. Hadn't Britain previously dangled the promise of Arab independence to secure their support against the Ottomans? Could a single piece of paper rewrite centuries of belonging? For the Palestinians, 1948 began what they still call the Nakba catastrophe, a wound that is yet to heal. But how did this single year become such a pivot point, carrying generations along its fault line? To understand, we have to journey back decades before Jewish flags were raised over Tel Aviv, and towns predominantly Arab and Muslim, with long-rooted Christian and Jewish minorities. Too many local families, the olive groves and market streets, were simply home, part of an inheritance stretching back centuries. Yet to Zionist eyes, these same hills and fields shimmered with promises older than Rome itself. The Bible spoke of God telling Abraham, "To your offspring I will give this land." Was it possible for two truths to exist on the same patch of earth, each burning bright with conviction? In the waning years of the 19th century, an idea began to kindle in European cities among Jewish intellectuals, merchants, and weary families who had endured centuries of suspicion and sudden violence. This was Zionism, a movement sparked by Theodor Herzl in 1897. Herzl's vision was both radical and heartbreakingly simple: a safe homeland where Jews could live as a free people. Could they ever have imagined that their longing would set countless other lives on a collision course with history? At that time, Palestine was under the fading control of the Ottoman Empire. A land quilted together by villages driven by rising anti-Semitism in New Europe, waves of Jewish immigrants began arriving in the early 1900s, seeking to rebuild a nation from ancient dust. With the Ottoman Empire's defeat in 1918, Britain assumed control over Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, setting itself as caretaker over a land increasingly fraught with conflicting dreams. As Jewish communities organized themselves with remarkable unity and even built defensive militias like the Haganah, Arab villagers saw the writing on the wall. Then came the horror that dwarfed all previous tragedies: the Holocaust. In the late 1940s, ships crowded with Jewish refugees sailed toward Palestine. It's only to be blocked by British naval patrols. And in 1948, the world watched as the dream of one people became the nightmare of another. This was how 1948 became more than just a date. It became a living, fractured line, one that still pulses with longing loss. The UN partition plan and its aftermath by the late 1940s, the sun was finally setting on the once mighty British Empire. War-weary and drained by the colossal sacrifices of fighting Nazi Germany, Britain found itself tangled in a conflict far from its own shores, a conflict that seemed to defy resolution. In the dusty streets of Palestine, where British soldiers patrolled nervously past crowded markets and stone alleyways, the tension between Jewish immigrants and the local Arab population had become a powder keg. Bombings, ambushes, riots, each new incident added to the unbearable weight pressing down on London. Though many fretted that the land promised them was narrow and disconnected, it was still the cornerstone of statehood. After wandering from Russia's frozen villages to Poland's ghettos to the horror of Hitler's camps, could this fragile UN blueprint finally fulfill the ancient promise spoken to Abraham? They argued that all of Palestine rightfully belonged under Arab rule. David Ben-Gurion, soon to become Israel's first prime minister, understood the historic weight of this moment, and hearts on both sides burning with questions of justice, survival, and ancient promise. But the ink on those maps was barely dry before history hurtled forward, dragging everyone with it into the turbulent next chapter. What awaited them was not the tranquil dawn of two peaceful states side by side, but something far more explosive, a reality that neither parchment nor prophecy had fully prepared them to face. Though many Jews dreamed of reclaiming all of biblical Israel, including full control over Jerusalem, they saw in the UN plan a rare, perhaps fleeting opportunity to carve out sovereignty from the uncertainty of exile. Could it be wiser to accept half a promise now, hoping that destiny, or perhaps divine favor, would fill in the rest in time? And if you had stood there on the threshold of history, listening to radios crackle with news from the UN Assembly, would you have dared hope that such a split might bring peace? Or would you, like so many in the crowded coffee houses of Jaffa and the synagogues of Tel Aviv, have felt a cold shiver that this was merely the calm before a far greater storm? In their eyes, the swelling Jewish population was not an indigenous return, but a modern colonial project, immigrants backed by Western money and might steadily buying up fields and building new cities on what had been Arab ground. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Even if that inheritance was sliced into awkward parcels, it was life, sovereignty, home. Was this fractured land worth another generation of British blood? Can you imagine living on land your family had tended for generations, only to be told by foreign powers that more than half of it would now become someone else's nation? At that time, Jews made up roughly 30% of the population and legally owned less than 10% of the land, yet the plan awarded them the majority share. To Palestinian Arabs, and indeed much of the Arab world, this felt like a raw wound opened by colonial arrogance, a betrayal of their own aspirations for independence. Was this not simply another chapter in a long story of European powers dividing Arab lands for their own designs? With domestic support crumbling and soldiers increasingly caught in deadly crossfire, Britain did something it had not done before. It stepped back and handed the burning question of Palestine to the brand new United Nations. Perhaps this international body, forged from the wreckage of global war, and clothed in the idealism of preventing future bloodshed, could do what empires could not. In 1947, as Jewish paramilitary groups tightened their campaigns and Arab leaders warned of holy war, the UN put forward a daring answer: the Partition Plan. Broad swaths of yellow and brown ink, carving up a land that for countless families was not lines and coordinates, but the soil that cradled their ancestors. According to the UN's vision, roughly 55% of Palestine, though a patchwork of jagged territories, would become a Jewish state. The remaining 45% would be reserved for an Arab state, with Jerusalem standing apart, watched over by the world. It was both simple on paper and thunderously complicated in reality. Under this plan, Palestine would be split into two independent nations, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem, that glittering jewel fought over by prophets, emperors, and crusaders for thousands of years, would be placed under international governance, belonging not to one nation, but to all humanity. Recognizing its sacred weight for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Have you ever pictured what those first maps must have looked like? To Jewish ears, This was a trumpet blast through centuries of silence. Yet on the Arab side, the proposal was received like a thunderclap of injustice. Arab leaders, their voices sharp with betrayal, denounced the partition plan outright. Meanwhile, within the Jewish community, the mood was a fragile blend of celebration and anxious calculation. This is how 1947 set the stage. With lines drawn on a map, sacred sites placed under international watch, the 1948 War of Independence, Nakba, on a warm afternoon, May 14th of 1948. In a modest hall in Tel Aviv, still adorned with British symbols soon to be stripped away, David Ben-Gurion rose to read a declaration that would reshape history. His voice, steady but laced with gravity, proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. Outside, Jews danced in the streets, tears mingling with laughter, for they believed they were witnessing a miracle centuries in the making, the return of the exiles. The fulfillment of countless prayers whispered beside European hearths and chanted in synagogues across generations. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. Palestinian narratives underscore the expulsions, the whispered threats, the armed raids that left families with little choice but to flee. Mothers trying to calm children with stories of olive groves left behind. Old men tracing lines in the dust where once they had walked courtyard paths. The West Bank and Gaza became swollen with these displaced souls, their eyes always turning back toward the invisible horizon of what they had lost. It is a paradox that lies at the heart of this conflict. The very day of national jubilation for one people is the day of mourning for another. Millions of Palestinians remain refugees or descendants of refugees scattered across neighboring countries, the occupied territories, and distant continents. Yet their dreams still orbit the same patch of land. And Israel, vibrant yet vigilant, remains ever conscious that its survival was born in fire, and that old prophecies and old grievances still walk its streets, whispering that the past is never truly past. Somewhere in this tangle of memory and promise, might there still be a path to shared humanity? Or is the weight of history simply too heavy to allow both people's stories to find peace on the same soil? The answer perhaps waits just beyond our grasp, hidden in the next turn of this ancient, sorrowful, though and still unfinished tale. Does history ever offer clear villains and victims, or does it more often weave both into a single tragic tapestry? Could anyone have guessed then that this displacement would not fade with time, but instead calcify into the very bones of Palestinian identity? Yet, whatever the reasons, flight, by fear, by force, or by hope of imminent return, the result was unmistakable. A vast population suddenly without a homeland, cast adrift into a hostile world. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, fell under Jordanian rule, while Gaza came under Egypt's control. It is a living grief. A wound reopened every May 15th as Nakba Day is commemorated throughout refugee camps and crowded city squares. Banners unfurl, chants rise, and aging Qism pass down through 3 or 4 generations, by now held high as symbols of a homeland they still claim. What would it feel like to clutch such a key, knowing it no longer fits any lock, yet refusing to let it go? But to countless Palestinians, lines on a map offered no comfort. Their homes lay beyond those new borders, sometimes just over a ridge they could see each morning. The right to return to these homes, or at least to have the choice, became a rallying cry that would echo through decades, stubborn. Aching demand for recognition, restitution, and dignity. But across other villages and towns, hearts sank. In living rooms where families still clutched deeds to orchards and keys to front doors, a different fear was taking root. What would this new declaration mean for them? And even before dawn could break on this newborn state, the answer thundered across the borders. On May 15th, armies from 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon surged into the land, determined to snuff out Israel before it could plant its flag too deeply into the soil. Thus began what Israelis call the War of Independence, a desperate fight for survival. and what Palestinians remember as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Imagine the chaos of those days. New Israeli recruits, many still haunted by the ashes of European ghettos, now scrambling to defend outposts with barely enough rifles to go around. Meanwhile, Palestinian families packed hurried bundles, shepherded flocks down ancient roads, or watched the skies for the telltale dust clouds of approaching convoys. Some fled at the first echo of gunfire, clutching children and sacred heirlooms, convinced they'd return in weeks. Others were driven out by advancing Israeli forces under operations like Plan Dalet, designed to secure the shaky borders of the fragile new state. Villages that had stood for centuries, where generations had drawn water from the same wells, were emptied, and in many cases reduced to rubble, their stones scattered like the lost memories of those who once called them home. Was it hope or terror that pushed them on the belief that Arab armies would swiftly reclaim their towns, or the dread of being caught in the jaws of battle? Over 700,000 Palestinians were uprooted in that whirlwind of war. Historians still argue fiercely over the root causes. Israeli accounts often emphasize that many Arabs left voluntarily, heeding calls from Arab leaders who promised a quick victory and safe return. Picture the refugee camps that sprang up almost overnight in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, tents flapping under the relentless sun. When the guns fell silent in 1949 and armistice lines were drawn, Israel found itself in control of roughly 78% of historic Palestine. It's far more than the original UN partition plan had allotted. This is why the Nakba is not merely an episode in dusty textbooks for Palestinians. Meanwhile, for Israelis, the same events mark a birth soaked in struggle and sacrifice, a miracle pulled from the jaws of annihilation. So, the story of 1948 continues to ripple outward, shaping identities, stoking fears, and sustaining hopes on both sides. The road to the Six-Day War. The turbulent days of 1948 did far more than redraw borders on old British maps. They carved lasting scars into the hearts of two peoples, birthing national stories that stand in haunting opposition. What they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, did not merely uproot families from houses and fields. It tore apart the very fabric of their society, scattering their people across refugee camps and foreign cities, infusing generation after generation with a bitter longing for justice and return. It is not just a chapter in history, but a living force that drives calls for the right of return, a plea that millions of refugees and their descendants be allowed to reclaim homes lost in 1948. Each side holds fast to its memory, believing it is the key to understanding the pain of today. In just 6 days, barely enough time for the dust to settle on ancient roads, Israel's forces swept through and seized the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. Its consequences echo not only in political corridors but in the small, intimate spaces of family dinner tables. Prayers whispered under olive trees and fiery sermons in packed synagogues and mosques. For Israel, stunning victory solidified their place in the region and secured strategic buffers against hostile neighbors. For Palestinians, it deepened their sense of loss and statelessness, layering new grievances atop old wounds. Even today, the issues born from that war, the status of Jerusalem, the future of the West Bank, the fate of refugees, the security concerns of Israel, remain the knots at the very center of the conflict. Could anyone truly untangle them without first understanding how these events seared themselves into the souls of both peoples? What began as a preemptive strike amid rising threats ended as a breathtaking expansion of territory, by children growing up with songs of return or banners of defense. The past is not past here. It sits at every table, walks every street, and whispers that resolution will demand far more than signatures on treaties. It will require somehow reconciling to fierce, sacred narratives into a single, fragile future. And who can say if that future is close or still heartbreakingly far away? Perhaps it waits like so many dreams in this land, just beyond the next sunrise. Israeli soldiers wept at the Western Wall, placing their hands on the stones as if finally embracing a long-lost mother. Could they be blamed for seeing it as divine affirmation, another step in fulfilling timeless promises? Could either truly set aside such foundational stories without feeling they had betrayed their ancestors? Each May 15th, as Palestinians mark Nakba Day, their marches and vigils echo with songs of sorrow and defiance, pressing the world to acknowledge their suffering. Meanwhile, for Israelis, the War of Independence is enshrined as a holy deliverance from annihilation, proof that against all odds, they could resurrect their ancient homeland and stand sovereign once more. Imagine growing up clutching rusted keys your grandparents once used to open doors to sunlit courtyards, knowing you might never cross that threshold again. Could any peace ever truly take root when one people's day of deliverance stands forever as another's day of mourning? For Jews, the establishment of Israel after millennia of dispersion was nothing short of prophetic vindication. Overnight, hundreds of thousands more found themselves under Israeli control, their futures entangled in a military occupation that would stretch on not for years but for generations. Was it possible, as they watched settlements begin to rise on lands they once tilled, to believe that their hopes for a free homeland hadn't just been buried beneath bulldozers and barbed wire? For Israelis, this was restoration, the miraculous culmination of a 2,000-year-old dream. For Palestinians, it became the foundational trauma, the raw wound from which their identity as a dispossessed nation still bleeds. And it is this clash of collective memory, each side seeing the same history through painfully different lenses, that makes every peace effort stagger under a burden of old grief. When two peoples build their very sense of self around opposite sides of the same story, how do they ever find common ground? A moment when ancient psalms and promises finally seem to spring to life. He who scattered Israel will gather them, and will watch over his flock like a shepherd, declared Jeremiah. And many in the fledgling Jewish state believed they were witnessing that very gathering. Their identity was reborn in triumph, forged by sacrifice, lit by the hope of sovereignty at last. But for Palestinians, the same year unfolded as a devastating shattering of their world. So the events of 1948 laid down more than political realities. They cemented two irreconcilable narratives. The Nakba remains the rallying cry at the heart of Palestinian demands for self-determination. This is why the legacy of 1948 casts such a long, stubborn shadow over every negotiation table, every international summit. Then came 1967, a year that would again tilt the entire Middle East on its axis. But for Palestinians, and for the surrounding Arab nations, the outcome was a nightmare, solidified into concrete walls and checkpoints. The Six-Day War fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the region. So, the story continues, shaped by memories of 1948 and 1967. By holy verses that still seem to breathe across the hills. The spark of conflict, leading up to the Six-Day War. The storm that would explode into the Six-Day War did not gather overnight. It was born from 2 decades of smoldering tension, haunted by the ghost of 1948, a year that had left wounds still tender to the touch. Israel's very existence, they vowed, must one day be undone. This promise of reversal wove itself into the vibrant fabric of Arab nationalism, whose banners fluttered proudly in crowded city squares. Egypt's charismatic leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, stood at the helm of this movement, his words crackling over radios across the Arab world, calling for unity against what he portrayed as a foreign implant on Arab soil. As the United States and Soviet Union vied for influence on every continent, the Middle East became one more chessboard. Could a people so recently humbled by colonial powers truly accept a new state in their midst, one that flourished while old empires crumbled? He then closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, effectively strangling Israel's maritime lifeline to the Red Sea. Israeli leaders read this not merely as a provocation, but as a noose tightening around their nation's throat. As Arab armies massed on multiple fronts, Egypt in the south, Syria in the north, Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula, and Gaza were wrenched from Egypt. The West Bank and East Jerusalem, taken from Jordan, The Golan Heights, torn from Syria, the old city of Jerusalem, with its labyrinth of holy sites cherished by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, now lay under Israeli control for the first time since antiquity. An Iraq threatening from the east, the small Israeli state found itself hemmed in by forces that vastly outnumbered it. Could a people who had endured centuries of exile and slaughter fail to see this as the mighty hand of God? But across Arab lands and among Palestinians, the aftermath tasted of ashes. Refugee camps swelled, again, as new waves of displaced families joined those still dreaming of 1948. The bitterness ran deeper now, intertwined with humiliation and a burning resolve to one day reclaim what was lost. And so the Six-Day War, though stunning in its brevity, wove new threads of anguish and defiance into a conflict already steeped in memory and myth. Could they afford to wait and hope the world would intervene before their enemies struck? Could it be that in this land so burdened by prophecy and promise, victory and catastrophe are forever destined to share the same soil? Perhaps only time, or something greater than time, will tell if these ancient rivalries might one day give way to a different story. Until then, the echoes of 1967 still roll across the hills, whispering of battles won, homes lost, and a fragile hope awaiting to be born. In turn, Israel, though still cultivating ties with many nations, found itself increasingly anchored to the West, benefiting from U.S. economic aid and diplomatic backing. Could any spark between local rivals now avoid igniting a global blaze? The creation of Israel, celebrated by Jews as the long-awaited rebirth of their ancient homeland, was to many Arabs a grievous rupture. The bitter Nakba that displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and shattered their own visions of nationhood. On the Sinai sands, Israeli tanks clashed with Egyptian divisions. To the east, they pushed into the hills of the West Bank, capturing ancient towns that had changed hands countless times over the centuries. In the north, they stormed up the rocky slopes of the Golan Heights under relentless Syrian fire. Jerusalem, so long divided by barbed wire and snipers' nests, became the heart of an emotional crescendo. When Israeli paratroopers finally reached the Western Wall, their tears baptized the ancient stones. Was this the echo of King David's joy when he first danced into the city with the Ark of the Covenant? Or a prelude to new sorrows yet unwritten? Across capitals in Cairo, Damascus, Amman, and Baghdad, leaders nursed these wounds into fierce determination. Israeli fighter jets roared toward Egyptian airfields in Operation Focus. In mere hours, they destroyed the bulk of Egypt's air force. While it still sat vulnerable on the tarmac, sending plumes of black smoke spiraling into the sky, Israel's pilots returned to their bases with adrenaline still pounding in their veins. They had won the skies, securing the critical advantage that would shape all that followed. But it wasn't only soaring speeches or bruised pride that made war seem inevitable. The scars of the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict never fully closed. Jordan held the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt administered Gaza, Syria clung to the Golan Heights. Yet these territorial arrangements were fragile bandages over deep, festering disputes along Israel's borders. Sniper fire and artillery shells became grim punctuation marks to daily life as farmers tended fields under the uneasy watch of distant gun emplacements. Did ordinary families on both sides of these lines ever lie awake at night wondering which dawn might bring the next barrage? The Suez Crisis of 1956 poured fresh fuel onto these simmering coals. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, asserting Egypt's sovereignty over a vital global artery, Israel joined Britain and France in a swift invasion aimed at toppling him, though international pressure forced their withdrawal. The war left Egypt and Israel glaring at each other across a widening gulf of suspicion and hatred. Was there ever truly a withdrawal of enmity once blood had already soaked into the sand? Meanwhile, the Cold War's long shadow fell heavily across the region. The Soviet Union poured weapons and advisors into Egypt and Syria, eager to bolster Arab armies that might counter Western-aligned Israel. In May 1967, Nasser made his move that would tip the delicate balance, ordering UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai. So, on June 5, 1967, Israel made a fateful choice, launching a preemptive strike it believed was the only path to survival. Then came a whirlwind of battles that blurred into each other. By the time the guns fell silent on June 10th, the map of the Middle East had been dramatically redrawn. Israel's territory had more than tripled. In Israeli streets, victory songs rang out, mingled with proclamations of divine providence. Today, the legacies of those 6 furious days shape every peace negotiation. Every skirmish along tense borders, every prayer uttered at the Western Wall or Al-Aqsa Mosque. The occupation and its lasting impact, the lightning-quick campaign of the 6th-day door, left the entire Middle East blinking in stunned disbelief. In less than a week, the ground beneath millions had shifted. Not merely in maps printed in newspapers, but in the most intimate spaces of memory and identity. For Israel, the victory was dazzling, and too many. Divinely ordained, territory tripled, borders erased, and Jerusalem long divided. A city of aching partitions and tense watchtowers finally united under Israeli control. But what began as jubilant parades and prayers at the newly accessible Western Wall also set in motion a far more complicated reality that would haunt generations to come. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, the Western Wall, the last remnant of the Second Temple, where countless exiles had wept for return, was in Jewish hands. For Muslims, the city is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, 2 of Islam's holiest sites, shining with golden light on the Temple Mount. These sacred places, tied to the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension, now stood within territory controlled by a state many Arabs viewed as an occupying force. Could any settlement truly be called just that did not account for these aching spiritual ties? Tears and joyful shouts mingled in the narrow plaza as soldiers pressed their foreheads against ancient stones, whispering prayers that had waited centuries to be spoken on that very spot. Unresolutions were drafted, debates flared in distant parliaments, and peace plans were proposed with hopeful signatures. Yet the reality on the ground only grew more entangled. The 6th-day war had decisively reshaped borders and power dynamics, but it also entrenched deep emotional divides that maps alone could never capture. To this day, every negotiation table still feels the long shadow of 1967. The fate of Jerusalem, the future of Israeli settlements, the right of Palestinian refugees to return all trace back to those 6 turbulent days. And perhaps the most haunting question remains: how does a land so rich in sacred memory, so filled with the footsteps of prophets and kings, bear the weight of 2 peoples each convinced that history and even God stand on their side? In this land promises thousands of years old still pulse beneath modern streets. Whether those promises will one day blossom into reconciliation, or whether they will continue to ignite fresh sorrow. Is a story still being written? One that every prayer whispered at the Western Wall or beneath the golden dome of Al-Aqsa continues to shape? Its high ridges offered Israel a critical buffer against attacks from the north. A natural fortress that commanders knew could be the difference between safety and sudden artillery rain on Israeli towns below. Hundreds of thousands more Palestinians fled or were displaced from these newly occupied lands, joining the great caravan of dispossessed families that began in 1948 with the Nakba. Tents multiplied in refugee camps across Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and within the West Bank and Gaza itself. Generations grew up knowing only these camps, their laughter echoing against canvas walls, their futures dimmed by stories of villages and orchards they had never seen but could describe in haunting detail. Could any child born amid ration lines and aid trucks ever be expected to forget where their grandparents once lived? Yet for Syria, the Golan remained an open wound. A plateau rich with memories of ancestral homes and springtime pastures, now guarded by Israeli tanks. The occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem became a central grievance for Palestinians, driving waves of protests, uprisings, and calls for international intervention. The rapid expansion of Israeli settlements across the West Bank further inflamed these tensions. with hilltops sprouting new neighborhoods complete with red-roofed houses and highways that many Palestinians saw as arteries of permanent dispossession. Each round of peace talks that stalled on the fate of this plateau only deepened the bitterness. Was this not, many wondered, the echo of divine promise? The fulfillment of verses like, "I have set watchmen upon your walls, O Jerusalem, which shall never hold their peace day nor night"? With the capture of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, Israel now found itself governing a vast new Arab population. More than 1 million Palestinians awoke from the brief thunder of war to find themselves under Israeli military occupation. Of a sovereign state rising from the hills and olive groves of the West Bank, from the crowded streets of Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its glittering capital, could such hopes ever breathe freely under the watch of another nation's soldiers? Roads that once linked towns freely now bristled with checkpoints. Israeli soldiers patrolled alleyways where children played soccer, and new rules were imposed by commanders from a foreign chain of command. Was it protection? Was it punishment? Or simply the iron necessity of an occupying power securing its hold? This was the dawn of what the world would come to call the Israeli occupation, a term loaded with pain, politics, and fierce disputes over what justice truly looks like. Palestinians living in these territories began to articulate a vision of their own. The dream of independence, meanwhile, the capture and annexation of East Jerusalem, was perhaps Israel's most emotionally charged triumph. But across the Arab world, the loss of East Jerusalem cut like a dagger. The Golan Heights, seized from Syria, added another layer of strategic tension. Perhaps most devastating of all, the Six-Day War poured new fuel onto the already raging Palestinian refugee crisis. And so the war, though stunning in its brevity, wove new complications into a conflict already snarled with history. The international community, watching from afar, wrung its hands. Global powers and their influence. Israel's astonishing triumph in the Six-Day War wasn't forged by military genius alone. It was the fruit of intricate alliances, shadowy promises, the weighty hand of global rivalries that stretched far beyond the Middle East. The battlefields of 1967, May, had been littered with burned-out tanks and silent aircraft. But the forces that truly shaped the war coursed through diplomatic cables and ideological fault lines spanning continents. In the years leading up to the conflict, the United States emerged as Israel's most crucial backer. Though American pilots never took to the skies over Sinai or the Golan, Washington's strategic embrace of Israel was unmistakable. From bustling New York synagogues to quiet gatherings in London and Paris diaspora, Jews dug deep into their pockets, driven by a fervent belief that the young state of Israel represented, it's not just a nation but the rebirth of an entire people. Donations bought rifles, supplied hospitals, funded settlements, the tangible building blocks of a nation determined never again to stand defenseless. Could any check written in distant hands truly measure the weight of such ancestral hope? Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem brought millions of Palestinians under its military rule, and affirming the right of every state in the region to live within secure and recognized boundaries. Yet the resolution's language was slippery. Its wording over the territories versus simply territories, leaving room for endless interpretations. The Six-Day War became a catalyst for movements like Fatah and the Palestinian Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat, fueled by rage and a burning desire for self-determination. These groups vowed to reclaim Palestinian lands through both political maneuvering and armed struggle. The lines drawn in 1967, both on maps and in hearts, remain etched with painful clarity. Could there yet come a day when the descendants of those who fought across these deserts and hills find a way to share the land their ancestors once claimed under the same sun? Or is the soil too soaked with memory to ever bear such fragile new shoots of peace? Perhaps, as it has so many times before, this land waits quietly, cradling both promise and sorrow beneath its ancient stones for another chapter yet to be written. Refugee camps once filled with quiet despair now rang with revolutionary slogans. Children who grew up tracing family villages on old maps came of age ready to fight for them. Would this become the diplomatic seed of future peace, or a cleverly ambiguous script that both sides could claim supported their cause? It also served as a rallying cry that echoed far beyond Palestine, drawing support moral, financial, and sometimes militant from across the Arab and Islamic world. Each new settlement built, each checkpoint established, each clash in narrow streets only reinforced a narrative of resistance that has refused to die. Roads that once carried farmers to markets now hosted checkpoints, red-tiled roofs, fresh roads, and burgeoning communities signaled to many Israelis the fulfillment of ancestral ties to Judea and Samaria. But to Palestinians and much of the watching world, these settlements stood as stubborn symbols of occupation, legal under international law, carving up the very land that might have formed a future Palestinian state. Could such demographic and geographic realities ever be untangled by negotiations alone? Families that once watched sunsets from village rooftops now navigated curfews and military orders. The bitterness of defeat for the Arab world was compounded by the human cost. Hundreds of thousands more Palestinians were displaced from newly occupied lands, swelling refugee camps that had already overflowed since the Nakba of 1948. The Cold War cast its long shadow over every decision. Moscow viewed Egypt under Nasser, Syria, and even Jordan as strategic wedges against Western encirclement. Soviet advisors poured into Cairo and Damascus, training officers, planning campaigns, and shipping columns of tanks, batteries of anti-aircraft guns, and squadrons of fighter jets. Yet when the crucial moment came, Arab military coordination faltered. Command structures tangled in miscommunication and rivalries. And Soviet-supplied arsenals could not make up for fractured strategies in Israel's audacious preemptive tactics. In those frantic 6 days, the Soviet dream of reshaping the Middle East into its own ideological stronghold suffered a shattering blow. While the Soviet Union lavished arms and advisors on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, the U.S. found in Israel a steadfast ally to counter Moscow's ambitions in the oil-rich Middle East. Could superpowers ever truly care about local struggles? Or were these small nations merely chess pieces in a far grander game? Its borders now wrapped around East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the entire Sinai Peninsula. The victory was heralded across Israeli streets as almost miraculous. Paratroopers who had wept at the Western Wall, Judaism's most sacred site, touched by Jewish hands for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, returned home to heroes' welcomes. Was this not the breath of old prophecies stirring once more in the dust of modern boots? Long before Israeli jets roared across Egyptian airfields in their preemptive strike, American aid had poured into Israeli coffers. Military packages provided Israel with tanks, artillery, and perhaps most pivotally, aircraft. Israeli squadrons flew into battle with a mix of sleek French Mirage 3 fighters and formidable American supplied jets that would prove decisive in achieving total air supremacy. Even as bullets flew, American diplomats maneuvered in the halls of the United Nations, shielding Israel from punitive resolutions and buying it the critical hours needed to secure victory on the ground. Officially, the U.S. urged a ceasefire. Yet it did little to halt Israel's advances. Was this silent nod of approval another chapter in the unspoken language of great powers? But America was not Israel's only patron. In the 1950s and early 1960s, France had been Israel's chief arms supplier, building the backbone of its air force with the sale of Mirage jets and sophisticated weaponry. These very planes would slice through Arab defenses in 1967, tipping the scales irreversibly. Yet history is never content to stand still. In the war's aftermath, France shifted its sympathies toward Arab capitals, leaving Israel increasingly reliant on American might. Was it merely business, or did European guilt and pragmatism twist together in these changing alliances? Meanwhile, money streamed in from Jewish communities scattered across the globe. On the other side of the lines, Arab armies stood bolstered by Soviet patronage, consequences, and lingering questions, the war's immediate outcome seemed to place Israel unassailably atop the region. Yet the triumph came with consequences that would prove both complex and enduring. The United Nations responded with Resolution 242, calling for Israel's withdrawal from territories occupied in the recent conflict. As the years rolled on, Israeli settlements began sprouting across the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. In the crucible of defeat, Palestinian nationalism was reborn with new urgency. And so the occupation became not just a political dilemma, but a daily, grinding hardship. To this day, the ghost of the Six-Day War walks alongside every negotiation team, every UN resolution, every diplomatic handshake. The enduring Abrahamic covenant at the very center of the spiritual understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict lies something far older and deeper than political agreements, modern borders, or even centuries of war. It is the ancient covenant that God made with Abraham, your people and your father's household. To the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. To your offspring I will give this land. Was there any way for Abraham, looking up at the same stars we see today, to fathom how this promise would ripple through millennia, stirring empires and kindling both hope and heartbreak? A covenant that was not simply about blessings for a people, but intricately tied to a particular piece of earth. A land that would stand forever as a testimony to divine promise. It becomes a profound spiritual battleground. It stands as the jewel of this covenant, a city that has drawn the hearts of prophets, psalmists, and countless pilgrims. What resolution could ever satisfy both earth's longings and heaven's decrees? Perhaps that is why the conflict endures with such stubborn intensity. It is not merely a dispute over territory. It is, in the eyes of many, a direct contest over the unfolding of God's plan for Israel, and by extension, for all nations. The land promised to Abraham is more than a piece of geography. It is a living testimony that God keeps His word. And for countless believers across the globe, that means the story is far from over. It means the outcome holds weight, not just for one region, but for the destiny of the entire world. So the next time news flashes across a screen showing clashes in Jerusalem, or debates over settlements in the West Bank, consider what lies beneath the headlines. Could it be that these modern struggles are simply the latest chapter in an ancient covenant drama? A story written by God's own hand, still being told before our eyes. Is it any wonder that so much of the world's spiritual energy seems to circle this one small hill? To question Israel's right to exist in the land of their forefathers? In the land granted by divine covenant, feels too many like challenging God's own word, like attempting to unravel a plan meticulously woven from eternity past. Could it be that behind every diplomatic summit and every border skirmish, there lies an unseen realm where ancient promises and spiritual forces contend? In Genesis 15:18-21, God laid out the borders with startling precision, describing a land stretching from the river of Egypt to the great Euphrates. Later in Genesis 17:7-8, God confirmed it again, saying that this land would belong to Abraham's descendants through Isaac as an everlasting possession, an eternal gift woven into the very fabric of His divine plan. Could any human decree ever truly override such a declaration? Imagine that long-ago moment recorded in Genesis 12, when God spoke to a man living amid the bustling pagan cities of Mesopotamia and called him to a journey unlike any ever taken. Go from your country. It is a living inheritance that pulses through prayers recited daily, through tears shed at the Western Wall, through songs sung on the hills of Jerusalem. They read these same passages and see in them the unbroken faithfulness of God, faithfulness that assures them of His sovereignty over history. Many believe that these promises to Abraham remain active, that God's pledge to give this land to the descendants of Isaac is still very much alive today. For them, watching the modern struggles over Israel is not simply witnessing geopolitical maneuvering. It is standing on holy ground where prophecies continue to unfold. The land of Israel and Jerusalem at its heart is more than soil. It is a sacred trust, a tangible thread tying their destiny directly to the very words of God. How could they ever surrender what they believed was placed in their hands by the Almighty Himself? This covenant was not vague or metaphorical. For Jews, this promise is not some dusty relic locked away in ancient scrolls. And for countless Christians around the world, this covenant is equally significant. This is why, for so many believers, the conflict over the land is not just a matter of politics or competing national narratives. And what of Jerusalem, the city chosen by God to bear His name, where Solomon built a temple that once glowed with His glory? Yet the mystery remains. How does humanity, flawed and fractured, navigate such a divine inheritance when two peoples lay claim to the same sacred ground, each with deep roots and fervent prayers? The prophecy of dry bones in return all throughout the Old Testament. Like golden threads woven through ancient parchment run prophecies foretelling both sorrow and hope for the people of Israel. Again and again, the prophets spoke of a time when Israel would be scattered to the far corners of the earth, driven out because of rebellion and disobedience. Yet within those same warnings shone astonishing promises that one day, against all odds, these scattered people would be gathered from among the nations, brought back to their ancestral soil by the very hand of God. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. Slowly, astonishingly, the bones begin to rattle and draw together, tendons appearing, flesh covering them, until at last breath from God Himself fills their lungs. Did echoes of Ezekiel's prophecy ring in their hearts as they breathed in the warm air of a land promised thousands of years before? For many Christians, watching these events unfold was like witnessing Scripture burst into bloom before their eyes. The establishment of the modern state of Israel was not just a political victory or refuge after unimaginable suffering. It was seen as a miraculous signpost on the end times road. Could this be the first movement in a divine symphony that would ultimately culminate in the return of the Messiah? The once dead stand again, a vast army reborn. As Jewish exiles returned, many Palestinians found themselves displaced, sowing seeds of conflict that still flourish painfully today. No other ancient nation vanished from its homeland for 2 millennia, and then returned, reviving its language, rebuilding its cities, and replanting its vineyards on the very hills where prophets once walked. Could this alone not serve as a living testament that God keeps His promises, even when centuries seem to stand in the way? It is one of the deepest tensions in this narrative that a prophecy fulfilled for one people can mean loss and grief for another. How does one reconcile such divine mystery with human anguish? Later in the chapter, God makes the metaphor plain. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. The dry bones have stood up, breath has entered them, and the story, though far from complete, marches inexorably toward its appointed end. And so the questions linger, carried on desert winds and whispered in prayer across countless congregations. What chapter comes next? How will these ancient promises intertwine with modern hopes and heartbreaks? And when the final breath of prophecy fills every corner of this land, will the world be watching, ready to witness the hand of God move once more? Could there be any clearer declaration of restoration, of a divine reversal that only God Himself could accomplish? Centuries before modern diplomats ever signed maps or set up embassies, the prophets painted vivid portraits of exile and return. Among these, none is perhaps as haunting or as vividly symbolic as the vision given to Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 37, the prophet is transported by the Spirit of the Lord into a valley littered with dry bones. Bones bleached by sun after nearly 2 millennia of wandering front, the bustling alleys of medieval Prague to the dusty markets of Baghdad. From the frozen streets of Moscow to the crowded quarters of New York, the Jewish people began streaming back to the very land from which they had once been expelled. Was it mere coincidence that after the horrors of the Holocaust, a people seemingly ground to dust found breath again, rising to declare a new nation in their ancient homeland in 1948? and times so hopelessly lifeless that no human could ever imagine them stirring again. Can you picture standing there beside Ezekiel, gazing over that desolate plain, wondering what tragedy could have reduced a nation to this? Then comes God's startling command. Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. For countless believers across the world, this prophecy leaped from sacred text into living reality in the 20th century. Imagine what it must have felt like for Jewish survivors of concentration camps to step off ships in Haifa, their feet touching the same soil that Abraham had once walked. And yet, this miracle of gathering did not come without profound complexities. Still, the sheer improbability of Israel's rebirth after nearly 2,000 years continues to stir awe. Today, as planes descend into Ben Gurion Airport and children play in the streets of Jerusalem, many see each sunrise over this contested land as another heartbeat in God's relentless covenant. Jerusalem, the crown jewel. If Israel is the heartbeat of God's prophetic plan, then surely Jerusalem is the crown jewel, the luminous centerpiece of a divine tapestry woven across millennia. This city, perched upon its hills and gleaming under the Middle Eastern sun, holds a significance that transcends politics and borders. In 2 Chronicles 6-8, God declares through Solomon, "But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people Israel." In the New Testament, it stands again at the epicenter of redemption. The prophets spoke of its future with an urgency that seems to echo louder with every passing decade. That global powers would be drawn into conflict over it, and that attempts to wrench it from its ordained place would only bring harm upon themselves. What is it about Jerusalem that makes it the spiritual nerve center of the world? A place where 3 great faiths intersect, sometimes peacefully, often with heartbreaking violence. Could it be that its very turmoil points to how high the stakes truly are in God's unfolding plan? That whoever controls Jerusalem stands symbolically at the crossroads of eternity? Doesn't this sound hauntingly like today's headlines, where world leaders convene urgent summits, draft resolutions, and yet find the issue of Jerusalem impossibly thorny, always slipping through human fingers like sand? For countless Christians watching the modern conflict unfold, Jerusalem's status as a divided city, claimed fiercely by both Israelis and Palestinians, seems less like a new crisis and more like the ancient words of Zechariah coming alive. Could it be that we are witnessing prophecy walk right across the evening news, each broadcast merely the next chapter in a story God outlined long ago? In Zechariah 12:2-3, God unveils a startling vision of the last days. "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations." Prophets assure us it will one day become the center of global worship and peace, where nations will stream to learn the ways of the Lord. But until that day dawns, Jerusalem continues to stand as the immovable rock, testing the wisdom of kings and the patience of prophets, reminding us that God's purposes are often written in places the world might least expect, and that His plans once spoken will unfailingly come to pass. Perhaps it is precisely because this city carries the weight of so many divine promises that it draws so much human striving. And perhaps in the tension we see today, there lies the surest sign that God's story for Jerusalem, and through it for all of us, is still being written line by sacred line. All who try to move it will injure themselves. It was here that Jesus wept over the city's fate, declaring in anguish, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling." It was here that he was crucified outside its gates and resurrected on the 3rd day, forever sealing Jerusalem's place as holy ground for Christians. Is it any wonder why millions travel from the ends of the earth just to walk its ancient streets, touch its stones, or pray at its walls? This wasn't a casual choice. From among all the sprawling empires and bustling cities of the ancient world, God set His affection on this singular place, marking it as the earthly seat of his divine presence. Could there be any other city where heaven's story collides so profoundly with earth's struggles? It stands not only as a testament to human history, but as a sacred stage where the deepest mysteries of God's interaction with humanity continue to unfold. It was on Mount Moriah, within Jerusalem's bounds, that Abraham raised the knife over his son Isaac, only for God to intervene and provide a ram. This pivotal moment would echo through Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic traditions as the ultimate test of faith. Centuries later, David captured this stronghold of the Jebusites and established it as the capital of his kingdom, famously dancing through its streets with the Ark of the Covenant. His son Solomon then built a temple so magnificent that nations marveled, and within its walls the glory of God visibly descended among his people. Jerusalem's unparalleled place in prophecy begins with how intimately it is tied to God's own name. Let's trace Jerusalem's sacred legacy. Jerusalem didn't fade into the background with the Old Testament's closing pages. Yet Jerusalem's destiny isn't confined to history books or pilgrims' journals. Imagine the audacity of this prophecy, that this one relatively small city, neither the richest nor the most powerful by earthly standards, would become the stumbling block for entire empires. Still deeper questions stir the heart. Why did God choose this city above all others? So, Jerusalem remains perched like a crown upon the hills of Judah, dazzling yet fragile, contested yet chosen. An enduring story, whether you look at it through the lens of spiritual warfare, seeing ancient prophecies colliding with modern ambitions, or purely as a tangled web of political rivalries and human struggle. One truth stands out with haunting clarity. The conflict over Israel and Palestine is not just another regional dispute. It is part of a far larger, older story, one that stretches back thousands of years, etched into sacred texts sung in psalms, mourned over in exile, and fought over on dusty roads that have known the footsteps of prophets and kings. They perceive in this conflict not just the machinery of politics or the clash of national identities, but the pulsing heart of a spiritual battlefield. A place where promises made by God Himself are contended over by forces far beyond human armies or diplomatic envoys. Where every peace accord or fresh outbreak of violence seems to echo prophecies spoken millennia ago. This is a story that began when a wandering shepherd named Abraham was told by God to leave everything familiar and set out for a land he did not yet know. To hold compassion for others whose struggles and hopes may be different from ours, and to keep our eyes open for the ways God's hand might still be writing new chapters in the Middle East and in our own lives. Could it be that the ancient tensions and longings of this land mirror our own need for reconciliation, forgiveness, and peace? It binds together the past, present, and what many believe will be the final unfolding of future events. It truly means so much to hear your reflections. And if you'd like to help us continue creating these deep dives into the Bible's mysteries and their impact on our world today, you can support this channel through a super thanks. Your generosity doesn't just keep the lights on, it helps bring these timeless stories to more hearts around the world. Thank you for spending this time with me. May you walk away not just with more knowledge, but with a deeper sense of awe at how God weaves His plans through nations, through centuries, and perhaps even through your own life in ways you can't yet imagine. God bless you richly, and I can't wait to explore more of these incredible journeys together with you. Might it be that in this land, so small on the map yet so vast in meaning, the destinies of nations truly pivot? Could it be that understanding this ancient conflict is essential to understanding where the entire world is ultimately heading? It's a story that passed through Moses standing barefoot before a burning bush, through Joshua's trumpet blasts at Jericho, through David dancing before the ark in Jerusalem. It is a living thread in a story that began long before any of us drew breath. And tears of exiles and homecomings, of sacred promises and human failings. What can we truly take from this story? Perhaps it is that some struggles are far deeper than mere politics. They reach into the very soul of humanity, touching on questions of purpose, belonging, and divine destiny. For me personally, tracing this epic journey of Israel and Palestine reminds me how the echoes of ancient covenants, still shape our modern world in ways both mysterious and profound. It is a vivid reminder that what we see unfolding on the evening news is often only the surface of something far older and more intricate, something that began in the heart of God long before any nation drew its first borders. A story that may continue to shape the course of world history for generations yet to come. And perhaps in its unfolding, it still holds keys to mysteries none of us fully grasp. From the Roman legions who crushed Jerusalem and scattered the Jewish people to the farthest reaches of the known world, to the Crusaders who marched under the sign of the cross to reclaim it, to the Ottoman sultans who ruled it for centuries, to the British soldiers who patrolled its streets under mandate rule. Every chapter added new layers of complexity and longing. Is it any wonder then that this struggle continues to shape the global stage even today? Headlines from Gaza to Tel Aviv ripple across continents, stirring debates in distant parliaments and fueling demonstrations on university campuses. Oceans away, Jerusalem's contested streets can ignite passions as fiercely in Paris or New York as they do within its own ancient walls. Could any other strip of earth, barely larger than some modern cities, carry so profound an influence on the hopes, fears, and futures of so many? And it is a story that has never truly paused, even as empires rose and fell, even as modern nations drew fresh borders with the stroke of pens far from these ancient hills. Look closer, and you see how deeply this conflict is woven into the fabric of world history. Yet for many who see with eyes of faith, there is even more at work here. And so, this story, whether viewed through spiritual eyes or through the sobering calculus of geopolitics, continues its relentless march through history. Whatever the answer, one thing remains certain. The conflict over Israel and Palestine is far more than just a dispute over borders and governance. So, as we stand at this point in history, looking back over thousands of years of triumphs, and maybe the lesson for each of us is this: to walk humbly with our own stories, knowing that we too are part of a larger tapestry. If this journey through history and prophecy has moved you, or given you a fresh perspective, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments.